They lowered my son into the ground on a Thursday morning, and the sky had the nerve to be beautiful. No clouds, no wind, just clean Georgia light pouring down over a casket that held the only person in this world who still called me mama like he meant it every single time. 37 years old. My Nick. Gone. I stood at that graveside and I did not fall apart. I had made myself a promise the night before, that I would hold it together long enough to get him home one last time. The church had been full. The flowers were everywhere. People said the right things in the right order, and I received every word with grace, because that is what Nick would have wanted from me. My name is Tristine Mouton. I am 56 years old. I raised my son alone before I ever married. And I am going to tell you something that I am still, even now, working through completely. I brought Nick home for the repast, the way our family has always done. Every surface in my house covered: macaroni and potato salad and fried chicken and 3 different kinds of cake. People I have loved for 20 and 30 years moving through my rooms, touching my furniture, speaking his name with the particular tenderness people reserve for the young dead. But Nick was not there, and a house full of people cannot fill the space left by one person who belonged in it. I kept looking toward the kitchen doorway, the place he always appeared from on Sunday evenings, takeout bags in both hands, already talking before he cleared the threshold. 3 times a week, he called me. 3 times. Not because I asked, because he wanted to. That kitchen doorway stood empty all afternoon, and I felt it every time my eyes moved near it. I was standing near the fireplace, speaking with my neighbor Sandra, when I heard the knock. A man I barely recognized, my cousin Paulette's husband, someone peripheral, opened the front door before anyone could reach it, and a woman walked in. She was composed, dressed appropriately in dark clothing, modest, nothing theatrical. 2 small children at her sides, a boy and a girl, young, maybe 4 and 6 years old. She stood just inside the doorway and looked around my living room with the careful eyes of someone who had prepared themselves for exactly this moment. I did not know her, but I saw her before a single person introduced her, and something in the way she stood, planted, deliberate, like she had a right to be there, made me go still on the inside. Then Emlyn moved. My husband crossed that room before I could take a single step. Before I could even fully process the woman's presence, Emlyn was already at the door, already reaching for her hand, already speaking to her in a low voice with his back angled away from me. That movement took maybe 4 seconds. I have turned it over many times since. A man who did not know that woman would have looked to his wife first. Emlyn did not look at me at all. I stood where I was, and I watched him, and I filed every second of it away. The woman spoke to the small group that had gathered near the door. Her voice was measured, practiced. She said she was so sorry for our loss. She said she had cared deeply for Nick. Then she placed her hands gently on the shoulders of those 2 children, and she said that Nick was their father, and that she felt his family deserved to know they existed. The room shifted. I watched it happen on the faces of people I have known my entire adult life. The recalibration, the uncertainty, the careful glances moving in my direction. I did not look at Emlyn again. If you are watching this, and you have ever had to hold yourself together when everything in you wanted to come undone, stay with me. Tell me what time you are watching and where you are from, because what happened next took me a long time to fully understand. I crossed the room. I introduced myself to the woman quietly. I thanked her for coming. Then I excused myself to check on the kitchen. I needed to think. By the time the last neighbor left, Emlyn was already standing near the front door. I noticed it the way you notice something that does not quite fit the moment. A detail that sits wrong without announcing itself. He had been moving toward that door for the last 20 minutes, positioning himself, making small conversation with whoever drifted close, but never actually leaving his post. When my cousin Paulette gathered her children and her husband and made her way out, Emlyn touched her arm warmly and said goodbye, and then stepped back to where he had been standing. Marvin and those two children were still seated in my living room. He had made sure of that. He turned to the remaining family, my sister Lorraine, my aunt, two of Nick's closest cousins. And he said there was something important they all needed to hear. He used the word family when he gestured toward Marvin. Family. A woman not one person in that room had ever laid eyes on before today. And my husband called her family in my house, on the day we buried my son. I sat down. I folded my hands. I listened. Marvin spoke carefully. She and Nick had met 3 years ago, she said, at a gathering in Midtown. It became serious quickly. She had not wanted to complicate his life, so they kept things between themselves. She reached into her bag and produced a small envelope of photographs, printed, physical, the kind of choice that feels deliberate. The children were 4 and 6. She had named them herself because Nick had wanted to wait until things were more settled between them. She never wanted to come forward this way. But now that he was gone, she felt his children deserved what was rightfully theirs. She cried at the correct moments. The pauses landed where pauses are supposed to land. It was a performance built to move people, and around me I could feel it working. But I was not listening the way she expected me to listen. Nick spent every third weekend in Savannah the last 2 years, a commercial property investment he was managing personally. The timeline Marvin described placed them together during stretches when I knew exactly where my son was and who he was with. Because he called me from those trips. He sent me photographs of the building. He complained about the contractor. A man conducting a serious relationship in Atlanta does not spend his available weekends 3 hours away managing property alone and calling his mother about pipe fittings. The geography did not work. The timeline bent in places she did not realize I could see. Around me, Lorraine had her hand pressed to her mouth. Nick's cousin Raymond was staring at the floor. Emlyn was nodding, slowly, steadily. With the particular gravity of a man who had already processed this information and arrived at his conclusion long before today. That nod told me everything I needed it to tell me. When Marvin finished, I waited a full breath before I spoke. I asked her one question. I asked what Nick called her when they were alone, whether he had a name for her, something private, the way people in real relationships do. She paused. It was not a long pause. Most people in that room would not have registered it. But I have spent 37 years knowing my son, and I know what a rehearsed answer sounds like when someone is reaching for it. She said he called her baby, just baby. I nodded slowly and thanked her for coming. I told her I would need some time to process everything. The room began to settle. I excused myself and walked toward the hallway. Behind me, I heard Emlyn tell Marvin to wait just a moment before she left. I kept walking. I told Emlyn I was going to the foundation. I was not going to the foundation. I drove to Sostin Gaines's office on a Tuesday morning with nothing in my hands and everything in my mind. Sostin has handled Mouton family legal matters for 19 years. He knew Nick as a boy. He watched him grow into a man serious enough about his finances to sit across from an attorney at 29 and ask the right questions. When I called that morning, Sostin picked up before the second ring and said, "Come in." Nothing else. Just come in. That was enough. His office smelled the same way it always has. Old wood and coffee and something faintly like cedar. He stood when I entered, and for a moment neither of us said anything. There are people in your life who knew your child, and grief with those people carries a different weight. We sat down, and we let it sit between us for exactly as long as it needed to. Then I told him why I was there. I told him about Marvin, the children, the photographs, the claim. Sauce then listened without moving. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he opened a folder that was already on his desk. Already. He had been expecting something. Not this exactly, but something. He walked me through Nick's estate the way a man walks someone through a building he designed himself, knowing where every wall was and why. The LLC Nick, established 8 months ago, held the commercial properties, the investment accounts, and his ownership interest in the Mouton family land. What remained outside that structure, what sat in open probate available to any claim, was a number so small it would not cover 6 months of legal fees for anyone ambitious enough to pursue it. I asked about the life insurance. Sauce then said it had already paid. Named beneficiary, me. Under Georgia law, no outside claim touches a named beneficiary payout. That money was already mine and had been since the week Nick died. Then he told me something that required me to sit very still to receive properly. He said that even if Marvin retained the finest paternity attorney in Atlanta and proved every word of her story, which he did not believe she could, the Mouton family clause made the LLC assets legally unreachable by any outside claimant. The clause had existed for decades before I married. It predated Emlyn. It predated everything. And Nick had known exactly what he was doing when he restructured 8 months ago. Nick believed in planning. He believed in protecting assets. He believed that if you spent years building something, you should spend time protecting it too. Sauce then told me they had spent months discussing ordinary business risks, future liability, estate efficiency, and long-term protection of family property. The restructuring had not been a reaction to any specific threat. It was simply the kind of careful planning responsible people do before they need it. I heard that, and I set it down inside myself, carefully. My son had not been quiet those last months because something was weighing on him. He had been working, building, organizing, putting things where they belonged. He had not told me because Nick was the kind of man who handled things completely before he brought them to his mother. He did not want me to worry. He wanted me protected. I did not cry in Sauce-Than's office. I was not going to cry in Sauce-Than's office. But something in me shifted. The particular steadiness that comes not from the absence of grief, but from standing on ground, you suddenly realize, is solid. I looked at Sauce-Than and told him I needed 2 weeks of silence from our side. No response to Marvin's representatives, no filings, no communication of any kind. He nodded once. He closed the folder. He said, "Whenever you are ready, Tristine, I will be ready." I drove back toward the foundation, and I started thinking about who else I needed to call. Every morning for 6 days, Emlyn found a way to bring it up. He never pushed hard. That was the thing about him. He understood that a grieving woman does not respond to pressure, so he applied none. He came at it sideways, through the children, through Nick's memory, through the particular softness men use when they believe they are guiding you somewhere you do not yet realize they have already decided on. He would set his coffee down and say something like, "Those babies didn't ask to be in this situation, Tristine." Or, "Nick would have wanted to do right by his own blood." Each time, his voice carried that careful, managed tenderness. Each time I received it without expression and told him I was still thinking. I was not still thinking. I was already decided. I was waiting for the right moment to show him what decided looked like on me. On the 7th day, I called a small family meeting. Emlyn, my sister Lorraine, 2 of Nick's cousins. I made coffee and I set out the good cups and I waited for everyone to settle before I spoke. I told them I had spent time with this. I told them I had prayed on it. I told them that I was raised to believe that doing right does not stop being right simply because it costs you something. Then I said it. If those children belonged to Nick, then they deserved what Nick would have wanted them to have. I was not going to stand in the way of that. Marvine's lawyers could proceed with whatever claim they believed was legitimate. I would not obstruct it. The room exhaled. Lorraine reached over and touched my arm. One of Nick's cousins nodded slowly, like a man watching someone do something difficult and honorable. Emlyn reached across and took my hand, and I let him hold it. And I kept my face open and composed, and gave him absolutely nothing to read. But I was reading him. A man who loves his wife and fears for what she is giving away does not look relieved. He looks worried. He asks questions. He says, "Are you sure?" He says, "Let's think about this more." He says, "I don't want you to do something you'll regret." Emlyn did none of that. The tension left his shoulders the moment the words left my mouth. His hand on mine was warm and steady and completely, thoroughly unbothered. That relief was a confession. He did not know he had just made it. I thanked everyone for coming. I cleared the cups. I moved through the rest of that evening the way you move through something you have already finished with on the inside. Present enough to function, elsewhere enough to think. After midnight, when Emlyn's breathing had settled into sleep, I got up. I went to the kitchen. I sat at the table in the dark and I made a call. Fordham Thierry answered on the second ring. I had used him twice before. Once, when I needed a background check on a contractor the foundation was considering. Once, when a potential donor's story did not line up the way it should have. Both times, he was thorough, and both times, he was quiet about it. That combination is rarer than people think. I told him I needed him to find everything that existed on a woman named Marvin Broad living in Brookhaven. Everything. And I needed him to be invisible doing it. He said he understood. He asked no other questions. That was why I called him. I hung up. I walked to the bedroom dresser and stood in front of Nick's photograph for a moment. I told him quietly that I had it, that he did not need to worry. Then I got into bed, and I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 8 days, I slept without trouble. I was back at my desk by Monday morning. My staff moved around me with the particular gentleness people extend to someone they are not sure how to read. Deborah brought me tea without being asked and set it at the edge of my desk without a word. A younger staff member named Calvin stopped in my doorway, started to say something, thought better of it, and simply nodded. I thanked them all in the ways that cost me nothing, and I got back to work. There was a grant cycle to close and 2 community partnerships that needed correspondence, and I was not going to let either one sit because my life had cracked open. Work has always been where I go when I need to think without appearing to think. The foundation gave me that cover, and I used it fully. 2 days in, my cousin Paulette called. She was not calling to check on me. Not entirely. She had heard something, and Paulette has never been able to hold information longer than it takes her to find a reason to share it. She told me Emlyn had been talking. He told someone at their church that I was coming around. That grief had a way of softening a person. That I was going to do right by those children the way Nick would have wanted. I listened to every word. I thanked Paulette for calling. After I hung up, I wrote 4 words in the small notebook I keep in my top drawer. I closed it and went back to the grant correspondence. Sauce then called that afternoon. Marvine's attorney had reached out to his office requesting estate documentation, financial records, property holdings, the full picture. Sauce then told me he had acknowledged receipt and indicated he was in the process of gathering materials. His voice was dry, and even when he said it. He was not gathering materials. He was doing exactly what I had asked him to do, nothing professionally, for as long as it could be sustained without raising concern. Fordham reached me Wednesday evening. He was not a man who called with partial information unless the partial information was significant enough to warrant the call. He told me Marvin Broad had moved to Brookhaven 22 months ago. The property she was living in was not in her name. He had not yet completed the ownership trace, but he expected to have it closed by the end of the week. Then he told me, without my asking, that he had begun pulling on some threads connected to the people around Emlyn as well. He said it the way careful men say things they want you to have without making a production of giving it. I told him to keep going. Thursday, I sat through a full board meeting, presented the quarterly numbers, answered questions about the spring grant cycle. At one point, a board member named Bernard made a dry comment about the city's permitting delays, and the table laughed and I laughed with them. Genuinely, briefly, the way laughter still finds you even in the middle of something heavy if the moment is right. I was fully in that room, and I was fully somewhere else, and I have learned over the years that a disciplined mind can hold both without dropping either. Emlyn made dinner that evening. He asked about my day with his eyes soft and his voice lower than usual. Attentive in the way men become when they believe the hard part is behind them. He refilled my glass without being asked. He touched my shoulder when he passed my chair. I watched all of it and I understood exactly what I was seeing. A man performing peace. A man who believed he had already won. That night, I sat at the small desk in the corner of our bedroom and I wrote Nick a letter I would never send. I told him what I had so far. I told him I was not finished. I folded it in thirds and placed it in the drawer beside his photograph, and I turned off the light. The property ownership result was coming. I could wait one more day. Fordham arrived at 10 minutes past 6. Everyone else had gone home. He came through the side entrance the way I had told him to and walked into my office and set a folder on my desk without greeting me first. That was not rudeness. That was Fordham. He believed in letting findings speak before he did, and in 7 years of working with him on foundation matters, I had come to appreciate that quality more than I could say. I opened the folder. The Brookhaven property where Marvin Broad was living, the house, the address, the deed, belonged to an LLC called Bro Property Holdings. Registered in the state of Georgia. Registered agent, Emlyn Bro. The registration date was 4 years ago. The property had been placed into Marvin's occupancy 22 months ago. I read it once. I read it again. I set the folder down flat on my desk and sat with what I had just read, the way you sit, with something that reorders everything you thought you understood about a period of your own life. I had known for a while that my marriage had changed, not dramatically. There had been no single moment of rupture, no argument that left permanent damage. It had simply become something different from what it once was. Two people maintaining the shape of a life together, meals and conversations, and the ordinary movements of a shared household, without much underneath it anymore. I had told myself it was time. Age. The way long partnerships settle into something quieter. I had believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative. I understood now what that distance had actually been. It was not a marriage cooling. It was a man maintaining a second life I knew nothing about. Fordham spoke then. He told me there was more. Financial transfers between accounts he was still tracing. The full picture was not complete yet, and he would not bring me incomplete information. He needed another week. He also told me, with the particular care of a man choosing his words deliberately, that the people Emlyn had been making payments to were not all people I would recognize or expect. He wanted to be certain of every name before he put it in front of me. I asked him what he needed from me to finish. He told me. I opened my desk drawer and wrote him a check from my personal account. Not the foundation account. Not $1 of this touched the institution I had spent 20 years building. Whatever this was, it was mine to carry and mine to pay for, and it would stay separate from everything Nick's legacy had made possible. Fordham left the same way he came. I locked the folder in my bottom drawer and sat in my office alone for a few minutes. Not long. I did not have the luxury of long. Then I drove home. Emlyn was on the sofa watching television when I came through the door. He looked up and smiled and asked how the office had been. I told him quiet. I went to the kitchen and made dinner, nothing elaborate, just what was in the refrigerator. And we ate together at the table, and he talked about something he had seen on the news, and I responded at the right moments and kept my face exactly where it needed to be. He had no idea what was locked in my office drawer. Later, when the kitchen was clean and he had gone back to his television program, I stood at the sink and looked out at the backyard. And for the first time, I stopped trying to explain any of it away. The house in Brookhaven was real. The connection was real. The secrecy was real. Whatever Marvine's role was, she had not appeared out of nowhere. Whatever story Emlyn was telling me, it was not the truth. I did not know yet how much of what I believed about the last 2 years was wrong, but I knew it was more than I had imagined. The question that came next was one I was not ready to say out loud yet. But I was getting there. Sauce then called me on a Friday morning while I was reviewing contracts at my desk. He did not open with pleasantries. He told me that Theron Nellam had come into his office the previous afternoon to review the full estate documentation, the LLC structure, the asset schedule, the Mouton family clause in its entirety. Sauce then had prepared everything exactly as it existed. No additions, no removals. Just the documents Nick had built and the tradition my family had maintained for decades, laid out plainly for a man who believed he was walking into a straightforward inheritance dispute. I asked Sauce then what happened. He said Nellam read through everything without speaking. He was thorough. Sauce then gave him that. He went through each document carefully, asked for a moment to review the clause language a second time, and then sat back in his chair. And then, to no one in the room in particular, he whispered 2 words. No way. He had then requested time to consult with his client before any further discussion. Sauce then had told him to take whatever time he needed. The meeting ended there. I held the phone and I did not say anything for a moment. Not because I was surprised. I was not surprised. I had known since the morning I sat in Sauce then's office what anyone competent enough to read those documents would eventually find. What I was feeling was something quieter than satisfaction and something colder than relief. I had not had to file a single motion. I had not had to make a single public move. I had simply let the documents speak and waited for the right person to read them. I told Sauce then to keep waiting. He said he would. That same afternoon, Fordham called. He told me that in the course of monitoring the communication activity around Emlyn, he had identified a secondary phone, a number registered to a prepaid account that did not appear anywhere in Emlyn's known financial records. I had not known it existed. Fordham had found it by tracing the contact patterns of a number Marvine had been using for outgoing calls outside her regular activity. The 2 phones had been in regular contact. That afternoon, Marvine had called the secondary number. Fordham had the record of the call, its duration, its timing. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. He could not provide me the content. He did not need to. He told me Marvine's regular call patterns had changed significantly in the last 48 hours. She was making more calls than usual and receiving fewer. That was the behavior of a frightened person. Fordham then set a printed log on my desk. 27 calls between the secondary number and Marvin's phone across a 4-month period. I looked at the dates. The earliest call on that log was placed 9 days before Nick died. I sat with that. I took the dates and I counted backward, and I mapped what I could see, when the contact began, how frequently it ran, the rhythm of it. This was not 2 people reacting to a death and constructing a response. The timeline was too clean for that. This had been running before there was a death to respond to. I set the log down. I did not call Sauce then. I did not call Fordham back. I sat in my office until the light changed. And then I drove home and I made dinner and I moved through the evening the way I had learned to move, present on the surface, still and focused underneath. After Emlyn went to bed, I went to the dresser. I stood in front of Nick's photograph for a long time, longer than usual. I did not speak. There was nothing to say yet that was ready to be said. I just looked at my son's face and I let myself understand fully what the dates on that log meant. Fordham came back on a Wednesday with a second folder thicker than the first. He sat across from me and he opened it without ceremony. Wire transfers. 19 months of them, running from an account in Emlyn's name to an account linked to Marvin Broad. The transfers were regular, not identical amounts, which would have been obvious, but structured, varied just enough in size, and spacing to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. That kind of planning does not happen by accident. It requires forethought, consistency, someone paying attention over a long period of time. Fordham told me he was working to identify whether anyone had helped Emlyn set it up. I told him to put that at the top of the list. The total across 19 months was $63,000 and change. I looked at that number and I understood what it represented. Not just money, but infrastructure. Rent sustained. Children fed and clothed. A woman kept comfortable and available and ready for the moment she would be needed. An entire supporting life, constructed and maintained in Brookhaven, while Emlyn came home to me every evening and sat at my table and slept in my bed. Then I looked at the start date of the first transfer. 19 months. That was what stayed with me. Not the amount, the duration. People do not usually build something like that overnight. They build it because they expect it to matter later. Nick had not been sick. There had been no diagnosis, no hospital stays, no indication from any physician that my son's life was in danger. He was 37 years old, healthy, working, calling me 3 times a week, driving to Savannah to manage a property investment he was excited about. There was no obvious reason anyone would have expected major changes in our family. Yet Emlyn had been funding Marvin's life for 19 months. I sat with that. Not because I understood it, because I did not. The timeline did not fit comfortably inside any explanation I could see. I did not mention any of this to Fordham. Not yet. Instead, I told him I wanted every payment Emlyn had made to any person or entity over that same 19-month period. Every name, every account, every recipient. I wanted the complete picture. Fordham nodded. He closed the folder and left. That evening, Emlyn mentioned, with the careful casualness of a man testing water temperature, that he had heard Marvin's attorney had run into some complications with the estate paperwork. He said it with his brow slightly furrowed, performing mild concern, performing confusion about a process he understood far better than he was pretending to. I told him I wasn't sure what the issue might be and that I would check with Sauce then. Then I asked whether he wanted rice or potatoes. He said rice. The conversation moved on. I did not look directly at him for the rest of dinner. I watched him eat. I watched him pour his drink. I watched him lean back in his chair afterward the way he always did, comfortable and unhurried. And I thought about my grandparents. They had held 40 acres outside Atlanta when holding land as Black people in Georgia required a particular kind of endurance that most people today cannot fully imagine. They held it anyway. My mother received it from them and passed it to me with the same instruction she had received. You do not lose what your people bled to keep. I had taken Nick to those 40 acres when he was 11 years old. He walked the fence line beside me and asked how long it had been ours. I told him longer than most people's memories. He nodded with that seriousness he carried even as a boy. I was sitting across from a man who had spent 19 months building something in secret. I still did not know exactly why, but I knew it had not been impulsive. I knew it had not been recent. And I knew there was more beneath it than I had uncovered so far. I kept my face still. I cleared the dishes. I went to bed. The next morning, I was up before sunrise. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out over the yard. And I understood one thing with a clarity that did not waver. I was not going to be the generation that lost what my family held. Fordham set the report on my desk at 5:30 and told me a forensic imaging specialist had completed a preliminary analysis of the photographs Marvin Broad had submitted. He said it quietly, the way people say things they know are going to land hard. Then he told me he would be outside when I was ready. He left and pulled the door closed behind him. I opened the report. The specialist had identified significant irregularities in every photograph Marvin had produced as evidence of her relationship with my son. Everyone. Some were stronger than others. Some required additional examination. But taken together, they pointed in the same direction. The images did not appear authentic. The report outlined why. Nick's face appeared to have been pulled from multiple publicly available sources. His Instagram account, the Mouton Family Foundation website, and photographs that had circulated among family members over the years. Several images showed inconsistencies in lighting, perspective, and digital layering. Others contained metadata problems that suggested editing. The specialist stopped short of making a final legal conclusion. That was not his job. His job was to identify whether the photographs deserved deeper forensic review. According to his report, they did. Strongly. I turned the page. The specialist had included side-by-side comparisons. In one image, Nick was seated beside Marvin at a restaurant table. Beside it was a source photograph taken years earlier. I knew it immediately. Nick was laughing at something outside the frame, his head turned slightly, caught in one of those unguarded moments that cameras rarely capture well. I recognized that laugh. I recognized the angle of his shoulders. I recognized the expression. I had seen it my entire life. The report did not say with certainty that the image had been fabricated. What it said was that the facial features aligned so precisely with the source photograph that independent forensic verification was recommended. The specialist's wording was careful. Mine was not. Someone had taken my son's face and placed it where it did not belong. That much was obvious. The man in those photographs had been somewhere else entirely when they were supposedly taken, living his actual life, managing his properties, calling his mother, not knowing that someone was collecting pieces of him for a story that would be told after he was gone. I set the report down. Fordham had said he would be outside. He stayed outside for a long time. I am not a woman who comes apart easily. I was not raised that way, and life did not allow it, and I have never found much use in falling apart when pieces still need to be moved. But I sat in that office and let myself feel what I had been holding back since the morning they lowered my son into the ground. Not grief. I already knew grief. This was something different. This was the pain of watching someone use a man who could no longer defend himself. A man who could not walk into a room and say none of this is true. A man who no longer had a voice available to him except the people who knew him best. Nick called me Mama until the day he died. Not Mom, not Mother. Mama. 37 years old and still saying it the same way he did when he was a boy. He was honest in the small moments. The moments where honesty costs nothing. I knew what kind of man my son was. And I knew what kind of people look at a man like that and decide his face is something they can use. I sat with it until I had felt it completely. Then I stood. I washed my face. I straightened my blouse. I returned to my desk. And I picked up the phone. Fordham answered before the second ring. I told him I needed two things: the DNA results, and the full name of every person Emlyn had paid that he had not yet been able to identify. Everyone. My voice did not shake. It was not going to shake. There was still too much left to do. Fordham called me on a Thursday morning with something he said could not wait until the end of the week. Marvine's call patterns had shifted. She had been reaching outside her normal contact list. Irregular timing, shorter calls. The kind of communication behavior Fordham described as someone who is trying to find an answer without being seen looking for it. One of those calls had gone to a paralegal named Denise, a woman Fordham had worked alongside on a fraud investigation 2 years prior. They were not close, but they were the kind of professional acquaintances who remember each other's instincts. Denise had called Fordham the same evening because the call felt wrong. and she trusted that feeling enough to act on it. Marvine had not given her name. She had presented the question as hypothetical, a situation involving a civil claim that turned out to be grounded in false information. She wanted to know whether the person who filed such a claim could face criminal exposure once the falsity was established. She had asked it carefully, the way people ask questions they have already partially answered for themselves and are, hoping someone will tell them they are wrong. Denise had not known the connection to anything Fordham was working. Fordham knew immediately. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I sat quietly for a moment and I thought about what a woman does when she starts making calls like that. She is not loyal anymore. She is not committed to the plan anymore. She is doing the math on what the plan is going to cost her personally, and the numbers are coming back wrong. Marvin was not looking for reassurance. She was looking for a way out. And a woman looking for a way out is a woman whose cooperation is available to whoever reaches her correctly and first. Emlyn did not know any of this. Fordham had been monitoring the secondary phone, and the contact through it had not changed. Regular calls, steady tone. A man who believed he was still managing a situation that was already beginning to move beyond his reach. He was keeping Marvine calm with promises she was no longer fully believing. That gap between what he thought was happening and what was actually happening was something I intended to use. I called Sosthen that afternoon. I told him to reach out to Theron Nellam quietly, not formally, not on the record, just a professional conversation between two attorneys. The message was straightforward. If Marvine's side chose to submit voluntarily to a court-administered DNA test to confirm or deny the paternity claim, Tristine Mouton would view that cooperation favorably when considering how to proceed with the civil matter. Nothing threatening, nothing coercive. Just the simple arithmetic of what cooperation looks like versus what resistance looks like when the underlying claim has no viable legal path. Nellam already knew the claim was structurally dead. He had known it since the afternoon he sat in Sosthen's office and whispered 2 words to no one in particular. He advised Marvine to comply. She agreed within 48 hours. That evening, I attended a small foundation donor event, a quarterly gathering I had not canceled because canceling things was not something I was prepared to do. I moved through the room the way I always did. Accepted condolences when they came, thanked people for their support of the foundation's work. At one point, a woman named Gloria, someone I had known for 20 years through church and community work, held my hand and told me she had never seen anyone carry grief the way I was carrying it. She said it like it was a gift I possessed. I thanked her, and I meant it more than she understood. I drove home alone after the event ended. I thought about Marvine in that house on Ashford Lane. 2 children asleep in the back of the house, a phone she was using less confidently than she had a month ago, a man calling her from a number that did not officially exist, and telling her to stay steady. She was beginning to understand something that Emlyn had not yet accepted. His promises had an expiration date, and it had already passed. The envelope arrived at Sosthen's office on a Tuesday. He called me at 6:53 in the morning before my staff had come in, and before the building had filled with the sounds of a working day. He said it was here. I told him I was on my way. I drove across Atlanta in the early quiet, and I sat in Sosthen's office and I opened the report myself. He did not summarize it for me. He understood that I needed to read it with my own eyes, and he let me do that without interruption. The court-administered DNA analysis was unambiguous. The biological father of both children presented by Marvine Broad was not Nicholas Mouton. The biological father of both children was Emlyn Brough. I read it once. I set it down on the desk in front of me. I looked at it for a moment the way you look at something you already knew was true, but needed the documentation to make real in the fullest sense. There is a difference between knowing and holding the proof in your hands. I had known. Now I was holding it. I looked up at Sosthen and I told him I was ready. He said he had been ready. I spent the next 40 minutes telling him everything. The Brookhaven property and the LLC registered in Emlyn's name. The $63,000 structured across 19 months. The secondary phone and the 27 calls. The earliest placed 9 days before Nick died. The fabricated photographs. Every composite traced to a source image taken on a day Nick was somewhere else entirely. The DNA result, now sitting between us on the desk. I gave him Fordham's name and told him Fordham would provide the complete documented file in whatever format the attorneys needed. Sauce then listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, he was quiet for a measured moment. Not the quiet of a man processing a surprise, but the quiet of a man organizing what he already suspected into the order it needed to go. Then he told me he would need 3 days to prepare the civil filings. Fraud. Conspiracy to commit estate fraud. Submission of forged documents in a probate proceeding. He also told me he would be making one call to a colleague who practiced criminal law and handled exactly this category of referral. He said the name of the firm, and I recognized it. Then I told him the part I had been carrying the longest. I told him about the financial timeline, the transfers beginning before Nick had any medical reason to die young, structured by someone with knowledge Emlyn did not possess on his own. I told him I needed Fordham's complete payment trace, every name on it, delivered to the investigators who handled cases like this one, not civil attorneys, the other kind. Sauce then said he understood. He said he knew exactly who to call and he would make that call today. I thanked him. I gathered my bag. I drove back across the city to my foundation, and I sat at my desk, and I worked through the rest of the day the way I had worked through every day for the past several weeks. Steadily, quietly, without letting what I was carrying show on the surface. That evening, I went home for what I understood, in some interior way I did not examine too closely, was the last time I would enter that house as a woman who had not yet acted. I made dinner. Emlyn came to the table and we ate the way we had eaten 100 evenings, plates and glasses, and the ordinary sounds of 2 people occupying the same space. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was getting through it day by day. He nodded with what arranged itself on his face as sympathy, and he reached for his glass, and I watched him do it. I thought about 20 years. I thought about Nick at 11 years old, standing in the doorway of our home the first evening Emlyn came to dinner, shaking this man's hand because his mother had asked him to trust her judgment. Nick had done that, without complaint, because he loved me enough to try. I finished my dinner, I cleared the plates, I said goodnight, and I went to bed. 3 days. Then it would begin. On the 3rd morning, I went to work early and I did not check my phone until I was sitting at my desk with the door closed. Sauce then had sent a single message at 7:41. It said, filed. Nothing else. That was sufficient. The civil complaint named Marvin Broad and Emlyn Bro. Fraud. Conspiracy to commit estate fraud. Submission of forged documents in a Georgia probate proceeding. Sauce then's criminal colleague had simultaneously forwarded the supporting documentation to the appropriate authorities for review. The forged composite photographs alone carried significant legal exposure, and the documented coordination behind the claim only deepened that exposure. 2 tracks, 1 civil, 1 potentially criminal. Moving through the proper channels before either named party had any reason to expect the morning was anything other than ordinary. Separately, through Sauce then's criminal colleague and relationships built over decades of legal practice, Fordham's complete payment trace had been delivered to the Fulton County authorities, along with a formal request that the circumstances surrounding Nicholas Mouton's death be reviewed. The full 19-month financial record. The structured transfers. The names of every person Emlyn Bro had paid across that period. No conclusions. No accusations beyond what the documentation supported. Simply a request that trained investigators examine whether the records warranted closer attention. I put my phone face down on my desk and I went into my staff meeting. We spent an hour and 40 minutes reviewing the spring grant applications. A program officer named Marcus walked the team through 3 community partnership proposals, and I asked questions. and gave direction and approved 2 of the 3 pending additional documentation from the applicant. The work was real and it needed doing, and I was fully present for every minute of it. My phone rang at 11:14. I saw Emlyn's name on the screen. I let it ring through to voicemail. 4 minutes later, it rang again. Voicemail again. At 11:30, I stepped out of the meeting for 5 minutes and I listened to the first message. His voice was tight in the particular way of a man who has been surprised by something he believed he had controlled. He was performing confusion. He was performing innocence. He said there must be some misunderstanding and he needed to talk to me and he did not understand what was happening and I should please call him back as soon as I could. I deleted the message. I went back into the meeting. Marvine was served at the Brookhaven house before noon. Theron Nellam had already warned her weeks earlier that she should consult separate counsel regarding any potential criminal exposure. His practice did not extend into that area, and he had been honest with her about that. Her attorney received the filing at the same time she did. Over the next several days, the documentation was reviewed carefully. The payment records, the property records, the forensic analysis of the photographs. Piece by piece, the situation became harder to explain away. By the beginning of the following week, both attorneys had given Marvine essentially the same advice. Cooperation offered possibilities that resistance did not. Marvine was given time to consider her position. Based on what Fordham had observed about her state of mind over the previous weeks, I did not believe she would need much of it. I drove home from the foundation that evening on a route that took me past the Brookhaven neighborhood. I did not make a point of it. I did not slow down when I passed the turnoff for Ashford Lane. I kept my speed steady and my eyes on the road, and I kept driving. The house was empty when I arrived. Emlyn had not come back. I did not know where he was, and I did not look for the answer. I went to the kitchen, and I made myself a simple dinner, and I sat at the table alone in the quiet of a house that no longer felt like it was hiding anything. It was the most peaceful meal I had eaten in months. Whatever came next was already in motion. I had done my part. The rest belonged to the law. Marvine did not use all the time her attorneys advised her to take. Within days, she sat down with investigators accompanied by counsel and began answering questions. The timeline of her relationship with Emlyn. When it began. What he promised her. What he told her the future would look like. The instructions he gave her regarding Nick. The story she was supposed to tell. The way she was supposed to present the children. The secondary phone she had been using. The names she knew. The payments she could explain. She did not know everything, but she knew enough. And she gave them all of it. Then she told them about a conversation that took place approximately 7 months before Nick died. She remembered it because she had finally grown tired of waiting. She had asked Emlyn twice when things were going to change. Both times he had avoided the question. That evening, he did not avoid it. He told her things would change soon. He told her she needed to be patient a little longer. Marvine admitted she did not ask him what he meant. She told investigators she already believed she understood the answer and did not want to hear it spoken aloud. The statement went into the record. Investigators treated it the way experienced investigators treat statements like that, as information requiring verification, not conclusions. It became one more piece among many pieces already being examined. The review of Nick's death continued. Meanwhile, the fraud case moved much faster. The paper trail existed, the photographs existed, the property records existed, the financial transfers existed. Those things did not require interpretation. Within a week, the story had begun moving through Atlanta, the way stories move through communities where people have known one another for years. Not through newspapers, through conversations, through church hallways, through phone calls between people who suddenly realized they had witnessed something very different from what they originally believed. My phone filled with messages. People who had been in my living room that afternoon. People who remembered Emlyn crossing the room before anyone else moved. People who wanted to say they were sorry. People who wanted to say they should have seen it sooner. I read each message once. Then I put the phone down and went back to work. Emlyn came to the foundation on a Thursday morning. I was in my office when Deborah called. Deborah has worked beside me for 11 years. She has seen this institution grow from a handful of employees into something respected throughout the city. She did not ask what I wanted done. She already knew. She told me calmly that Emlyn was in the lobby. She told me she had informed him I was unavailable. She told me she had asked him to leave. He left. 3 days later, shortly after sunrise, Emlyn Bro was arrested in the driveway of the home we had shared for 20 years. The charges were fraud, conspiracy to commit estate fraud, and submission of forged documents in a probate proceeding. The homicide review remained active. Investigators continued examining the financial records, witness statements, communication logs, and every piece of information that had begun surfacing since Marvin's cooperation. No conclusions had been announced, no determination had been made, but the review was no longer sitting quietly in a file somewhere. It was moving. I was not there when Emlyn was arrested. I was at Nick's grave. I had driven there before sunrise and sat beside him in the quiet. I told him what had been set in motion. I told him I was sorry that bringing the truth into the light had required so much darkness first. I told him I was glad the lies were finally collapsing under their own weight. And I told him I was not finished yet. Not completely. Then I stood. I brushed the Georgia dust from my skirt. I walked back to my car, and I drove to the foundation. There was still work to do, and it was not going to do itself. Several weeks passed before Sosthen called me on a Friday afternoon and asked if he could come to the foundation. Not his office, mine. I told him to come. He arrived at 4 o'clock and sat across from my desk. He looked tired in the way attorneys look when they have spent weeks watching documents accumulate into something neither simple nor pleasant. Then he told me what investigators had built from Fordham's payment trace. He spoke carefully and without rushing. I listened without moving. The trace had identified a man who existed on the outer edge of Nick's social world. Not a friend. Not family. One of those people who drift through gatherings often enough to be recognized but not remembered. The kind of person whose name you hear once and never think about again. Investigators discovered he had received 2 payments from Bro Property Holdings, LLC, totaling $11,000. Both payments had been made approximately 6 weeks before Nick died. Both had attracted attention once investigators began reconstructing the full timeline. The payments led to subpoenas. The subpoenas led to records. The records led to more questions. The man was a licensed veterinary technician. His employment records, inventory logs, and communications were examined over several weeks. Investigators discovered discrepancies that could not be explained easily. Purchase records did not fully match inventory records. Certain quantities of medication could not be accounted for cleanly. One substance appeared repeatedly in the review: succinylcholine. Sosthen explained what it was, without my asking. A paralytic agent commonly used in veterinary medicine. Difficult to detect. Difficult to investigate after the fact. The sort of substance that attracts attention only when investigators already have reason to look more closely. The technician initially denied any wrongdoing. Then he retained counsel. Then the evidence continued to accumulate. By the time prosecutors approached him again, the conversation was different. Sosthen chose his next words carefully. The technician had entered into a cooperation agreement. Not immunity. Cooperation. He admitted receiving money from Emlyn Bro. He admitted obtaining substances he was not authorized to distribute. And he admitted participating in conduct that investigators believed was connected to Nick's death. Every statement was documented. Every statement required corroboration. Investigators did not stop with his word. They compared financial records, communication records, employment records, travel records, everything they could independently verify. Then they went back to the medical examiner. Nick's death had originally been treated as an unexpected natural event. Preserved tissue samples still existed. Additional testing was requested. Additional testing was performed. The results did not stand alone. Sosthén emphasized that point. No single piece stood alone. Not the technician, not the financial records, not the laboratory findings, not the witness statements. But together they formed a picture. Prosecutors believed a jury could understand. That morning, the district attorney's office had formally expanded the charges against Emlyn Bro. The fraud case remained. The estate conspiracy remained. And now a murder charge had been added. Sosthén finished speaking. The room became very quiet. I had known. Not with evidence, not with documentation, with the kind of knowing that lives somewhere deep inside a mother long before facts arrive. I had known since the morning I stood at my kitchen window and counted backward from a timeline that never made sense. Now it was no longer instinct. Now it was part of the record. That did not make it easier. It made it permanent. I thanked Sosthén. Then I asked him to continue. He told me the Mouton estate had been formally closed to outside claims. The LLC held. The family clause held. The life insurance had never been vulnerable. Nick's commercial properties remained exactly where he had placed them. Marvine's claim was finished. Her own legal situation continued separately. Then, Sosthén reached into his briefcase and placed an envelope on my desk. 6 months before his death, Nick had executed a written designation, leaving a significant bequest to the Mouton Family Foundation. There was a letter. He had instructed Sosthén to hold it until everything was resolved. I took the envelope. After Sosthén left, I sat alone in my office and opened it. I read what my son had written during those last quiet months when he was protecting what mattered and saying very little about it. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully. I placed it in my bag beside the letter I had written to him. They would stay together. Months have passed. The legal proceedings are moving through their proper course, and I have nothing to add to what the record already contains. Verdicts will be what they will be. Sentencing will follow. I do not need to narrate any of it for anyone. What happened is documented in the Fulton County Courthouse and in the offices of attorneys who know how to read what the documents say. That is sufficient. That has always been sufficient for me. This morning, I drove out to the family land. 40 acres on the outer edge of Atlanta that my grandparents held when holding it required a kind of endurance most people today cannot fully measure. They were not given this land. They negotiated for it, worked for it, protected it through decades when the protections available to them were thin and unreliable and dependent on the character of people who did not always have any. They held it anyway, because they understood something that has moved through every generation of this family since, that land is not simply property. It is evidence. It is the proof, written in deed and soil, that you were here and that you intended to stay, and that you meant for your people to stay after you. My mother received it from them. She walked me across every acre of it before I was old enough to fully understand what I was being shown. She told me the names of the fence lines and the low places where water gathered after heavy rain, and the particular tree at the eastern edge that had been struck by lightning twice and survived both times. She told me what it cost to hold this, and she told me that the cost was not a reason to let go. It was a reason to hold tighter. I brought Nick here when he was small. He walked beside me the way he always walked, seriously, attentively, with that quality of presence that made people feel heard when they spoke to him, even when he was a child. I told him the same things my mother told me. He listened to all of it, and when I finished, he asked me one question. He asked whether the land would always be ours. I told him yes. As long as we held it, yes. He nodded and kept walking and never raised the question again, because for Nick, once a thing was understood, it was understood completely and did not require revisiting. The foundation is running. My staff is steady. The spring grant cycle closed cleanly and the summer cycle is already in preparation. Nick's bequest funded a new program, not announced with ceremony, not named in any public-facing material, just a program that moves money toward Atlanta families navigating the kind of legal and financial complexity that nearly swallowed everything he built. In the internal records, I named it after him. That is the only place his name needs to appear for me to know it is there. I think about Emlyn once, standing on this land in the morning quiet. And then I set him down, not with anger, not with the residue of 20 years unraveling into something bitter, with the clarity of a woman who can now see the full shape of a distance she once explained away as the natural cooling of a long marriage. She was wrong about what it was. She is not wrong about anything else. I do not wish him toward anything or away from anything. I simply think about him once, and then I do not think about him again. I think about Nick, not the case, not the photographs, or the documents, or the charges, or the courtroom. I think about his voice on the phone, the way it sounded on an ordinary Tuesday when he was calling about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. I think about the way he laughed at jokes I made that were not funny, fully, generously, the way a child laughs for a mother they love without reservation. I think about the last time I saw him, the way he stood in the doorway when he was leaving and turned back once more before he went. The hug that I did not know was the last one, and I am grateful I did not know because I was completely present for it, and so was he, and it was enough. It was more than enough. I am still his mother. That is the only thing in this entire story that was never in question. The only thing that could not be forged or filed against or claimed by anyone who had not earned the right to it. Everything else, the land, the foundation, the estate, the truth of what happened to my son, all of it required fighting for. That required nothing. It simply was, and it will simply continue to be for as long as I am standing. I stay on the land until I am ready. Then I walk back to my car. There is work to do. There is always work to do. And I have never once in my life been a woman who left her work unfinished.